Hello friends, my name is Jihaan Alayya and today I want to talk about something. Have you ever heard of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland? Well, most people have. It's one of those stories that's been around forever. A girl falls down a rabbit hole, meets strange creatures, and ends up in a world that makes absolutely no sense. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized there's actually a lot going on beneath the surface. So today, I want to walk you through what I found. Let's get into it. So let's start with the man behind the story. Lewis Carroll. That's actually a pen name. His real name was Charles Ludwig Dodson, a mathematician, a logician, an Anglican deacon. Basically, the most serious person you could imagine. And yet, he wrote one of the most imaginative and wonderful strange books in the history of English literature. And the story behind how this novel came to be is honestly really beautiful. On July 4th, 1862, Carroll was on a boat trip with three little crows, one of them named Alice Little, the daughter of his colleague at Oxford. To keep them entertained, he just started telling a story, an impromptu story, about a girl named Alice who falls down a rabbit hole. Alice loved it so much that she asked him to write it down. So Carroll spent months writing the whole thing by hand, illustrated it himself, and gave it to her as a personal gift. That manuscript eventually became the novel we know today. So in a very real sense, this book exists because of one little girl's curiosity. What makes Carroll so interesting as an author is this huge contradiction in his personality. As Charles Dodson, he was rigid, structured, and deeply logical. But as Lewis Carroll, he created a world where logic gets completely flipped upside down, where nothing makes sense. And somehow, that's perfectly fine. That tension between his two identities is something you can feel throughout the entire novel. Now, let's talk about the world Carroll was writing in, because context really matters here. Victorian England was a very strict society. Rigid class structures, formal rules, and children, especially girls, were expected to be quiet, obedient, and proper. Not exactly the kind of environment that celebrates curiosity or questions. And you can see Carroll quietly pushing back against all of that throughout the novel. The Victorian education system, he turned school subjects into jokes. Reading becomes reeling, writing becomes reading. The authority figures, the Queen of Hearts screams off with her heads every few minutes, but nothing ever actually happens. Carroll was basically roasting the entire Victorian establishment through a children's story, and getting away with it. And the trial scene at the end is probably the sharpest example of this. The court proceedings are completely irrational. The verdict is announced before the evidence is heard. The rules change constantly, and the king and queen exercise absolute power without accountability. Carroll even puts it directly into the dialogue. The queen literally says, "Sentence first, verdict afterwards." It's absurd, but it's also a very pointed satire of how the Victorian judicial system actually worked. Okay, now let's actually look at the text. And the theme that stands out the most is curiosity. The entire novel exists because Alice was curious. She sees a rabbit with a pocket watch, and instead of thinking, "That's strange," and going home, she chases it. Carol literally writes that she was burning with curiosity, and in another moment she goes down after it, never once considering how she would get out again. And this curiosity shows up in the smallest moments too. Before she even enters the Duchess's house, Alice crouches behind some trees just to listen to a conversation that has nothing to do with her. When the footman ignores her and won't let her in, she doesn't give up and walk away. She just opens the door and walks in herself, uninvited, no hesitation. That's curiosity operating at full force. My personal favorite is the mad tea party scene. The Domo starts telling a story. Alice promises not to interrupt, and then immediately interrupts. Multiple times, Carol even writes quite forgetting her promise. And when the Mad Hatter calls her stupid, she doesn't leave. She just turns back to the Domos and keeps asking questions, like nothing happened. And here's what I find really powerful about this theme. Alice's curiosity is what makes her brave in the end, because she spent the whole novel observing, questioning, and trying to understand Wonderland. By the final chapter, she sees it clearly for what it is, an illusion built on empty authority. And she's not scared anymore. She stands up and says, "You're nothing but pack of cards." Curiosity taken far enough becomes courage. Now, still on the text, I want to talk about one of the most iconic symbols in this novel, the rabbit hole, because it's so much more than just a plot device. The moment Alice sees the white rabbit disappear, she doesn't stop to think. She just follows. Carol writes that she was burning with curiosity and went down after it, never once considering how she would get out again. That's the first layer of the symbol. The rabbit hole represents what happens when curiosity completely takes over. No plan, no calculation, just a leap into the unknown. And what Carol puts inside the hole is just as interesting. It's not dark and empty. There are shelves, books, maps, pictures. Alice even picks up a jar of orange marmalade as she falls. She finds it empty, but instead of dropping it, she carefully puts it back. Even in the middle of falling, she's still curious, still careful, still herself. The rabbit hole doesn't change who Alice is. It reveals her. And when she finally lands, she doesn't find easy answers. She finds a hole full of locked doors, more confusion, more questions. That's the most honest thing about this symbol. Following your curiosity doesn't lead to simple rewards. It leads to more things to figure out. But by the time Alice leaves Wonderland at the end, she's completely different person from the bored girl who sat by the river bank. The rabbit hole was the point of no return, the moments before everything changed. Now, this is where things get a little different, because so far we've been looking at this novel from the outside, through the author's life, through history, through the themes and symbols Carol built into the text. But there's another way to read a book, and that's just as yourself. As a person who picked it up, read it, and felt something. So for this last part, I want to share some moments from Alice's adventures in Wonderland that I personally found surprisingly relatable. And I say surprisingly because honestly, I didn't expect a novel written in 1865 about a girl falling down a rabbit hole to feel this close to home. But it did. So let's get into it. When Alice thought talking to herself while falling, I genuinely recognized that. When I'm really bored or when everything around me goes quiet, I do the exact same thing. Carol never tells you Alice is talkative. He just shows it through this one small moment in the middle of a fall. And somehow that tiny details felt more real than anything. This one actually made me stop for a second. Alice tells the caterpillar she can't explain herself because she's not herself. And I think most of us have felt that at some point, where your own thoughts don't quite match who you believe you are. Carol captured something really honest in that line, something that doesn't get talked about enough. And then there's the moment where Alice scolds herself for crying. And I thought, yeah, I do that too. When something goes wrong because of my own lack of discipline or effort, I don't just feel disappointed. I get angry at myself. Carol shows through Alice that this kind of self-criticism is deeply human, but reading it from the outside, it also made me wonder whether that kind of harshness actually helps, or whether it just makes things worse. The Queen of Hearts honestly made me laugh. Off with their hats! Every single minute like it's her personal catchphrase. But then, I caught myself thinking, I kind of understand that energy. When something really gets to me, there's a small voice inside that wants to react just as dramatically. I don't act on it, but it's there. And I think Carol knew that most people would recognize it too. The Duchess scene hit close to home. Alice is clearly uncomfortable the whole time, but she just puts up with it because she doesn't want to be rude. I'm exactly that kind of person. If someone does something that bothers me, something I didn't ask for and don't want, my first instinct is almost never to say something. I just hold on to the discomfort quietly, like Alice bearing the Duchess's sharp chin on her shoulder. I tend to absorb discomfort rather than create awkwardness by speaking up. And reading this made me wonder, is that really kindness or is it just avoidance? And then there's the Griffin shaming Alice for asking a perfectly reasonable question. That one stung a little. I ask a lot of questions. I like to think things through, explore ideas, discuss things with people around me. So when Alice gets made to feel stupid for being curious, I felt that personally. And I want to say clearly, I think Griffin and the Mock Turtle were being completely unfair. Alice was in a world she didn't understand at all. Of course she was going to ask questions. Making someone feel ashamed for being curious is not wisdom. It's just impatience dressed up as authority. So when you put all of this together, the other's life, the historical context, the theme of curiosity and the symbolism of the rabbit hole, and the personal responses it throws out, Alice's adventures in Wonderland start to look very different from a simple children's story. It's a novel about contradiction, about questioning the world around you, and about what happens when you follow your curiosity all the way to the end. And I think that's what makes it still feel relevant today. 160 years later, because curiosity never really goes out of style. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't read it yet, maybe it's time to follow your own white rabbit. Bye bye!